on business challenges in the defense industry meets today to continue our dialogue regarding the health and the future of the nation's defense industrial base. And today we're hearing from two experts in the defense industrial base, and both these gentlemen have extensive expertise in the issues associated with maintaining an effective industrial base. Neither are strangers to the committee, and I'd like to welcome you back. The Honorable Jack Gansler, Professor and Roger C. Lippett's Chair and Director for the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise at the University of Maryland, and Mr. David Burto, Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Gansler's recently released book, Democracy's Arsenal, Creating a 21st Century Defense Industry, as well as Mr. Burto's work at the Center for Strategic and International Studies on the Defense Industries Initiative, lend great knowledge and insight into these extremely complex issues. In our hearings on the issue, we have heard from a variety of witnesses in the field and the Department of Defense about the current challenges and future projections regarding the United States defense industrial base. The conversation thus far has been very informative, as each and every person we meet with brings a unique perspective about how to learn from our past failures and establish stability in the industrial base. Today we continue the dialogue by focusing on the future, and doing so we are asking some very basic questions regarding the complex subject matter. What can we do to adapt the current environment to meet the needs of 21st century security strategy? What can we learn from other nations who are implementing strategies to deal with this critical issue? What changes are necessary in our workforce and acquisition policies to meet that vision? This panel has the opportunity to highlight the challenges and successes of the defense industrial base as we examine challenges to doing business with the Department of Defense. Our defense industry today continues to have a hard time getting clear requirements from the DoD, bridging the gap between development and fielding, and surviving the overly burdensome, unresponsive program management policies and regulations. Navigating these issues is difficult for large defense contractors and near impossible for small businesses. I'd like to take a moment to recommend that all members of the panel review a recent note. I got to get this right so I don't quote the wrong year. To review a recent RAND report, and that's not the one from 1958 that I so happily point out to people. I said to the staff the other day that did they just change the date on it, but I think there's some new and insightful findings. Each of the members has a hard copy of the report in their packet of hearing materials. This report reviews federal policy regarding small businesses and implications for future DoD policies and practices. Not only does it provide a primer on basic historical background on federal small business policy, but it also examines trends in DoD contracting practices and small business utilization. I think it will be a useful resource for the panel as we continue our work in this area. As I mentioned in our last hearing on November 1st, the panel traveled to Congresswoman Betty Sutton's district in Akron, Ohio in October. We met with small and medium-sized businesses working on highly technical solutions to deliver capabilities to our warfighters, and also met with members of the University of Akron faculty and leadership to discuss their efforts to advance technology to meet DoD needs. The committee staff has prepared a summary memorandum of the discussion with industry and has been provided to all the panel members. Without objection, I'd like this to be entered into the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. As I pointed out last time, our next field hearing roundtable will be happening on December 9th in Congressman John Runyon's district, the 3rd District of New Jersey. And these sessions are invaluable to the panel's work, and I hope all our panel members can join us on this trip. And at this time, we yield to the ranking member, Mr. Larsen, for any remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for filibustering until I can get here.
Traffic.
No, Spanish and science.
Exams.
Middle school.
Got it.
Spanish and science. It's been a while, so I had to do a little review this morning with my 12-year-old. But I want to thank you for putting this panel on, this particular panel today, and pleased to be joining panel members here today. This panel is charged with looking at the ways DoD can improve its business practices, not only for the benefit of the DoD budget, but for the benefit of local companies who want to provide services and goods to the warfighter. Over the past month, through hearings and district visits, we've gained some pretty valuable insight from the industry and about the department on the challenges our industrial partners face doing business with the department. In due time, I'm confident this panel will offer some recommendations to the full committee that will improve on some of these challenges. However, an important part of this task is understanding how the defense industrial base itself operates. And I hope the witnesses today can offer this panel a brief history of the events and factors that have shaped the current industrial base and what we should do in the future. I believe we're all aware of the key role our industrial complex has played with providing capabilities throughout the years in support of our national security. The industrial base has risen to each challenge from World War II to responding to the events of September 11, 2011. I'd appreciate 2001. I'd appreciate hearing from you on how our industrial partners must evolve, however, to meet the current economic constraints and the 21st century threats that we face, including to include global competition. Earlier this month, the panel heard from Mr. Brett Lambert, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. He made the point that references to the defense industrial base implies a monolithic entity, a reference that is inaccurate. The defense industrial base includes companies of all shapes, all sizes, resourced all around the world. I'm pleased to hear that DoD is currently attempting to map and assess the industrial base sector by sector and tier by tier with hopes that we can have a much better understanding than we have today of it. This will provide us and the Department a much better picture of what currently exists today and perhaps provide some clarity on how to move forward. The 2008 Defense Science Board's Task Force on Defense Industrial Structure for Transformation, chaired by Dr. Gansler, noted that the nation currently has a consolidated 20th century defense industry, not the required and transformed 21st century national security industrial base it needs for the future. So I look forward to hearing how we might get there. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Gansler and Dr. Burt today on what steps we must take to establish a 21st century national security industrial base. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for opportunity to provide opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Larsen. And with that, we'll proceed with Mr. Gansler, if you want to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. It seems to me it's very clear that there's a major clash coming in the next few years between the security concerns facing the United States and the shrinking resources available to address them. As Admiral Mullen, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stated in August of last year, quote, "The single biggest threat to our national security is our debt," unquote. The only realistic answer to this security affordability problem will be to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of our defense investments, both in equipment and in manpower. Unfortunately, the recent trends are adverse to this need. Rising equipment costs, rising logistics costs, rising personnel costs. It's also important to note that trends in the cost of weapons are opposite to the trends in the commercial world, where, for example, each generation of computer routinely provides more performance at lower costs, and suppliers traditionally introduce next-generation systems on an 18-month cycle, a far cry from our 15 to 20-year DoD development cycle. Now, these adverse cost and cycle time trends are matched by a growing concern about the U.S. losing its competitiveness and its innovation leadership due to the decline in its science and engineering workforce, and as the budget declines, the very likely reduction, which I am very concerned about, in research investments as the dollars shift to near-term needs. Obviously, the resultant loss of innovation from these adverse manpower and research trends will be felt in decreasing future U.S. international economic competitiveness and in the loss of national security technological leadership, both of which I think are catastrophic. Today, the nation faces a whole series of threats: terrorists, pirates, irrational dictators, religious fanatics, and so forth. But unfortunately, thanks to worldwide proliferation, these people have a greater access to increasingly lethal weapons. For example, 100 countries have ballistic missiles that are increasingly competent, and cyber warfare is becoming a great concern as potential adversaries develop sophisticated tools aimed at crippling not only the military and civilian infrastructures, but across the board. Clearly today, the security environment is very different than in the 20th century, as you just heard. So the nation has to prepare for 21st century security needs, even as fewer resources are available to do the job. There are new technologies available, there are required new modes of warfare, and there are new industrial structures that have resulted primarily from the horizontal and vertical consolidations that marked the defense industry in the years following the Cold War, as well as from the rapid advances that have taken place in the high-tech commercial world. And, I would argue, critically important has been the globalization of technology, industry, and labor. And, very important, the requirement for coalition military operations in the future. So, it is necessary to address our growing security affordability problem, and one of the major ways of doing that is to look at the question of how the DoD does its business. And I would argue both on the demand side and on the supply side. And these steps fall into four main areas. Overall acquisition process includes what we buy, that's the requirements process, how we buy it, that's the acquisition process, who does the buying, that's the acquisition workforce, and who the DoD buys from, which is the defense industrial base issues. And I would emphasize that these four issues are highly interrelated and that all four have to be addressed in order to achieve the required changes. In my prepared remarks, I addressed all four of these areas, and I've expanded upon them in the recent book that the Chairman just mentioned. In terms of, I could briefly highlight some of these changes, but given my time constraint, I'll assume that you have looked at the presented material. And
I'm sure in the questioning period we'll get you to elaborate.
Fine. So then let me just simply jump to the conclusions, which is basically that two things are required to make a cultural change, and that's what we're really talking about here. One is a widespread recognition of the need for change, and the other is leadership with a vision, a strategy, and a set of actions to implement that change. And that's up, as far as I can see today, up to the Secretary Panetta, the White House, and the Congress to implement these needed changes. There'll be resistance, no question about that, and it's going to be very challenging. But on the other hand, I believe it can be done, and I think it must be done, and I think our future national security depends on it, and our fighting men and women deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burto?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Larsen, members of the panel. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today. I particularly appreciate it that the hearing is moved to this room. There's a certain honor to sit in front and be able to read the panel here of Article 1, Section 8. I happen to carry in my pocket at all times a copy of the Constitution, and I have two phrases bookmarked here. One is Article 1, Section 8. The other, of course, is Article 2, Section 2. And much of our lives are spent on the interface between the role of the President as Commander-in-Chief and the role of the Congress as outlined in Article 1. I'm also struck, Mr. Chairman, by your opening remarks about the difficulties of solving these problems. When you get to this point in your career and you realize you spent a third of a century working on things that are all still just as broke in appearance as they were when you started, it can occasionally be a bit discouraging. However, my wife reminds me that if we hadn't been working on them, they'd be even worse. And I take some solace in that, if you will. I would like to summarize briefly my statement and ask my written statement be included entirely in the record. We define the industrial base as not only the hardware companies, which is what we typically look at, but the services companies as well. And I've got a lot of data, both in my testimony and drawn from our report on defense contract trends. I've provided a copy of this to the panel. The data basically show three key facts. One is that the federal government in general and the Defense Department in particular spends as much money on services contracts as they do on products contracts, and it's important to keep that in mind. The second key data point is that the percentage of the defense budget that goes to contracts has essentially doubled in the last 20 years. If you go back to 1990, roughly 35% of defense outlays was spent on contracts. In 2008, which is the year it reached its peak, it was about 65%. It's back down to about 53% now. And when we have fiscal year 11 data, which we don't quite yet have, we expect that to decline a little bit more, but it'll still stay roughly at 50%. And so we have a reliance on contracts and on the base that provides those contracts that's greater than it has been historically. And I think that's a significant issue, if you will. Contract dollars are roughly split between products and services. We separate out research and development as a third category. The reason is because from the Defense Department's perspective, R&D is part of the investment because it's connected to procurement, it's connected to products. From the government's database perspective, they count R&D as a service. So actually the single largest service contract in the federal government is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Now from my perspective, that's not a service, that's a product. Okay, but because it's R&D, it gets characterized as a service. So we separate out R&D. And my last data point that I would do in my summary here is that R&D is at a historic low as a percentage of total contract dollars spent. Now, the database that we use doesn't include classified contracts. We lump those in as well. It's still at a historic low. There are three big challenges facing the industry today from our perspective, and I should point out these are mostly my views. These are not. I use the data from CSIS, but my opinions here are my own. The first is the impact of the plan reductions and the budget reductions that are underway. The second is the importance to recognize that industry today, unlike industry in the past, has to remain competitive in the global financial markets, that we can no longer rely on just the federal government to provide the funding for these companies. They've got to be competitive financially. And the third is, where is innovation coming from in the 21st century? Because we have a history of relying on defense contractors to come up with innovation, and in today's world, an awful lot of new technology is coming not from defense, not even from the U.S., but from global sources, and recognizing and addressing those challenges, I think, a critical factor for this panel to address. So I'll be glad to go into those as we go into the question period.
Thank you very much. Why don't you go ahead and expound upon that, what you're talking about, the financial viability globally, a little bit.
The world in which we grew up in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s for defense contractors, the contractors depended on the government for their revenue for the most part, and particularly after the consolidation of the 90s. And it really didn't matter to them all that much whether a contract was awarded on June the 30th or on June the 1st, because they weren't subject to the swings of quarterly stock financial reports as much as they are today. Companies could often finance both through their own savings and through the progress payments that the federal government made, and so they were less reliant on the global financial market. Today's environment, and all you have to do is listen to the quarterly analyst calls that the CEOs and the CFOs of the major defense companies do, they are so dependent on their standing at Wall Street in a way that they were not historically, because they are part of the global financial community. Now, global financial markets invest their money irrespective of national security. All they're looking for is return, right? And if a better return can be obtained somewhere else, that's where they're going to go. The net result is that if defense companies are not competitive from a margin point of view, from a cash flow return on investment point of view, from a revenue point of view, if they're not competitive in the global financial market, that means they end up paying more for their cash. Ultimately, an increasing cost to industry results in one of two things: either an increased cost to the government or less capability for that industry to be able to provide to the government. That, I think, is a different situation than has been true in the past, and many of the government's rules and regulations regarding weighted guidelines for profit, regarding caps on fee, regarding how you manage contracts and negotiate contracts, tend to ignore the dependence of those companies on the global financial market. We haven't caught up in a regulatory sense with that global reality.
So we need to change the regulatory burden that we put on these companies from the DOD. Is that what you're...
I think we at least need to recognize two things, and I've actually been encouraged because both the former Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, Dr. Ash Carter, and the current Acting Undersecretary, Mr. Frank Kendall, have stated publicly the need to recognize that we're not trying to drive corporate profits to zero, that we're in fact need to recognize their legitimate need to be able to make money in order to stay in business. I think you reflected on the Defense Science Board study that Dr. Gansler led on defense industrial structures for the 21st century. I happen to be a member of that task force, and I believe we had a witness who testified before us, off the record of course, who mentioned the difficulty of driving costs down for a government contract. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his quote was something to the effect of, it's hard for me to explain cost, so it's easier for me to actually award a $1 billion contract with 5% profit than a $500 million contract with 30% profit, because nobody knows whether $1 billion or $500 million is the right cost, but everybody knows that 30% is excess profit. Now, this is similar to if I went to buy a car and I said to the dealer, I'm happy to pay you twice the amount for this car as long as I know you're not making any money off of it. That just doesn't make sense from a public policy point of view.
Right, right. And Mr. Gansler, if you want to expand upon, well, let's back up a second. Let me ask you both this question. And then you've been at this a long time, and we've got this study from the 50s at the Rand Corporation, and I think there's one from the 70s and the 80s and now the 2000. You know, what's the key element over in the Department of Defense, or is it here in Congress, that has caused this to not be able to be fixed over the years?
I think it's the emphasis on cost instead of price.
Value.
Value that you're getting. Lately, there's been even more of an emphasis in terms of technically acceptable low bid. That's just totally inconsistent with high-quality technology and high-quality services. Instead, this is a race to the bottom.
Right.
How cheap can we buy things instead of how you and I buy when we buy things? We worry about performance and we worry about price. The focus today is much more on simply low cost and trying to figure out how to drive down the costs as contrasted to get higher performance at lower cost. We've got to focus on the results, not the process. In fact, recently there have been a number of people in industry talking to me about the fact that the government is focusing more on compliance than they are on results.
Right, and we've heard that over and over again. It must treat our contractors like they're criminals. Before we find out anything wrong, we assume they're doing something bad. You have the same view, Mr.
Yes, sir. I'd like to add one thing to it. I think it really is critical to focus on results. You know, if you're, for instance, hiring a plumber to come fix a plumbing problem in your house, you don't actually put out an ad that says, please send me the cheapest plumber if possible, right? And if you found a plumber who actually works, you tend to go back to that person because you know you're going to get value added. But it's because you know how to define the outcome that you're looking for at the front end. And I think we not only have to have that focus on the outcome, but that outcome has to be defined in the requirements, not just written into the contract. And a lot of these problems stem from insufficient attention, particularly in services contracts, insufficient attention at the front end to what it is we want to achieve here, as opposed to just how many hours of time we want to buy from staff.
I believe Mr. Gansler used the word capabilities. You got to put that in. What is the end product going to be capable of, and that has to be clearly stated in the contract.
And that includes services, not just products.
Right.
As was pointed out, since last year, 57% of what we bought were actually services, more than a half of it.
Right.
All of our rules, regulations, training, policies, et cetera, are all based upon buying goods. And, you know, buying an engineer is different than buying a tank.
Right.
You don't put them through an R&D phase and a test and evaluation phase, but you do want to count on prior performance and demonstrated experience. I mean, you wouldn't get your heart surgeon on the basis of somebody with a degree and lowest hourly rate. You know, you check and see whether they had ever done a heart operation before and how well they did it, what the results were. But we're shifting the other way.
Right.
And that's partly because of the budget driving the sensitivity to cost. But it's wrong in terms of let's get high performance at lower cost. That really makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And that's the way the commercial world operates.
Before I yield to the ranking member, if Mr. Berteau, you would share the headline you showed with me.
I believe Mr. Chairman, I believe I put it back in my briefcase. It's but it's a headline from a three-star general in the Army Training and Doctrine Command, and his guidance on acquisition was, don't do anything stupid.
That's the headline.
It's a pretty good guidance, I think, as a starting point for acquisition and contracting. It is good guidance. It's sometimes hard to follow, but it's good to repeat it over and over again.
And with that, I'll give it to the ranking member.
Thank you. With all these analogies about jobs, I want to point out something. If I need a heart surgeon, I probably need a heart surgeon once, right? I'm not going to put him on contract for my life, literally for my life once, but for the life of my life, I only need that person once. Plumber, on the other hand, yeah, if the plumber does a good job, I may go back to her several times, but the question is, at what point then do I decide I need to go out and look around a little bit more? I need not to get used to this plumber too much, because maybe things are changing out there. Maybe I can get better service from someone else, and I can throw some competition into this. That's the challenge that we're facing. Even though the dollars are being squeezed, what I hear you saying is that it's going to benefit the larger contractors who already know the system or in the system, and it's going to be a tougher time getting some of the smaller mid-sized companies that we're hearing from into the opportunities that exist with contracting, whether they're goods or services for the DoD. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mr. Larsen, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing that keeps that plumber performing is, in fact, both the threat and the reality that there is competition out there, and that there's competent competition that's cost competitive and performance competitive. Even in companies, commercial companies that have long-term relationships with their suppliers, which is kind of what you'd think the government would want to get to, there's always that potential that we can pull the contract from you, we can find another supplier, we can qualify that other supplier, and we can competitively bid with that. And that threat has to always be out there, and I think it's incumbent on the government to have it in place.
I would argue somewhat in the sense that there's a new suggested policy that says every 3 years we should recompete, period. I would argue just the opposite, that we should recompete, as you suggest, when the contractor doesn't get higher performance at lower cost in that 3-year period. If they do, they deserve to be rewarded with a follow-on. If they continue to get higher performance at lower costs over and over and over, that's wonderful. That's exactly what we want. The threat of competition is a very good threat. The forced competition is actually a disincentive to do better and better. And we have to be very careful about doing competition smartly, not just for the sake of competition. A scorecard isn't the right answer. We want to reward people for good performance, and that means higher performance at lower cost. And we should reward them for doing that. We have to understand that incentives for industry is what should drive this whole operation.
How do we ensure that the incentives for industry drive the operation, and that we are allowing new actors the opportunity, new players the opportunity to participate in that competition?
Well, one of the easiest ways, the most effective way that we have had for many years now is the Small Business Innovative Research Program. That forces you to go to the small companies, which is great, and that has demonstrated very effective use of those dollars. And that I would encourage to be continued, even at the expense of the fact that the budget's shrinking. Because that's one way. I've talked to lots of small business firms that have been very successful and grown to be big firms as a result of starting out with the SBIR program. So there are techniques we have for the small business. Another thing I would argue that the small business mostly fits into the lower tiers. And so requiring it as a prime contract only on the scorecard, I think, disadvantages the small businesses in many ways. I think that's a shift that could be taken as well.
Yeah. Does it DoD manage the industrial base in a coherent way, or is it service by service, agency by agency, day by day?
As we've been out and looked at a number of specific programs, that is, weapon systems or categories of programs, ships, satellites, et cetera, what we have found is that an awful lot of the industrial base, the management or even awareness, because first element of management is actually having data that knows what's going on, that the first level is left up to the prime contractors to know who their subcontractors are and what those subcontractors' vulnerability are. And most prime contractors have pretty good insight into the ones that are part of their contract, but not necessarily the broader industrial base. Then at the program level, at the program manager level for the satellites or the ships, there's less awareness but a broader awareness inside the Defense Department. But when you get to the enterprise level across all of DoD, that's where it falls short. There's very little integrated data, and there's no process for incorporating that data in real time in actual decisions, so that when you're making a cut decision, for instance, you know what industries are going to be impacted by it. In part, Mr. Lambert, as he testified before this panel, is expecting that his sector-by-sector, tier-by-tier analysis will provide some of that information. There's two problems with it, though. One is it won't be comprehensive, because it's not every sector and across the board. They selected 7. The second is it won't be timely. It'll essentially be 2 years out of date by the time they've got it all rolled up. And so it won't be particularly useful, because the decisions that we're making are not backwards decisions. They're forwards decisions for FY13 and 14. So there's a lag there that they need to address.
I would suggest the one thing that has been misinterpreted, not by you, but often even by the press, and that is the concept of managing the industrial base.
Right.
This is not picking winners and losers. It is not picking company A instead of company B or company C. What it is trying to say, what kind of a structure do we want for that industry? We want it to be competitive. We want it to be innovative. We want it to be profitable. I mean, that's almost a dirty word for a lot of people in the government sometimes. And that's wrong, because that gives them the money to reinvest in research and in capital investment. So I think having the structure and looking at, do we have enough being at least 2 or 3 firms in any given sector for competition. I mean, the jet engine business has 2, but that's enough for serious good competition, as the Great Engine War showed. And so we don't have to pick winners and losers in managing the industry. What we do have to do is worry about the structure of the industry, its profitability, its innovation, its competitiveness. That's where I would focus, and make sure people understand when you say manage the industry,
right,
what we're talking about.
Good. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll save for a second round.
Sorry. Yeah, we'll have a second round.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yield back.
And with that, Mr. Runyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Mr. Gansler, as our U.S. industrial defense industry policy compare to our international powers around the world, obviously, sure, we probably think we're a little behind the ball, as your testimony says, but how does it look?
Well, I think one of the major and most important aspects of our industrial policy is that our speeches say we want to have the commercial world dual use, and we have barriers to doing that. By contrast, in terms of around the world, for many years now, the Japanese have had an explicit statement of dual use. I go through Japanese aircraft plants and I see the same machine tools being used on commercial and military. The Russians have a policy now of dual use, and they can implement it. And recently, the Chinese have come out with a statement of the importance of dual use industrial operations. This is not just taking a piece of commercial equipment, but it's having the factories integrated. And I might point out that, for example, Boeing used to build the commercial and military transports in the same plant. But as a result of cost accounting standards, they were forced to separate the commercial and military. In that case, it was allocation of independent research and development against the commercial. So penalizing the commercial, even though they were achieving enormous overhead absorption for the military. And so there's huge benefits of dual use. The idea that you get technology transfer, you get sensitivity to cost, you get higher volume for overhead absorption, and all these benefits. But we have barriers to dual use today. And the countries like China, Russia, Japan, others, who have an industrial policy that actually follows their speeches, actually can implement that dual use. We have recently even gone further, and now we're asking for proprietary data to recompete things after 3 years. Well, no commercial firm is going to give you their drawings. When you buy a car, you don't get the drawings in the glove compartment. Why would you want to do that sort of thing? It's another barrier being introduced, along with export controls. Most commercial firms want a world market. They don't want just the domestic market. I mean, the good example of that would be in the infrared business. We used to own the night. Because of our export controls, we no longer own the night now, in the sense that I heard from the night vision lab that the French are well ahead of us now in night vision devices because of our export controls. We need to review our policies relative to buying commercial and having integrated dual-use plants in order to be able to achieve world-class competitiveness. Because right now, with the high-tech commercial, there's a big benefit to the DoD. of being able to integrate plants and to buy commercial technology in the information area and a lot of other areas.
Now, does security policy and intellectual property play into that and the price of it also?
Absolutely. You have to be aware of the security sensitivity, and you have to be aware of the intellectual property sensitivity. But you can take care of those. I mean, one of the big issues right now is cybersecurity, because of the fact that everybody now is into the information age. And clearly, we have to start worrying about protecting not just DoD stuff, but commercial stuff. I mean, the power grid and things like that. So there's got to be a greater sensitivity to cybersecurity, and we do want to make sure that everybody protects intellectual property and highly classified sensitive stuff.
But is it to a point where I mean, to go, just talk about, a globalization of the workforce, are we afraid that we don't know what that tipping point is where security might actually cost us more and actually prosecution and follow-up of all that intellectual property being stolen, that might be a hurdle?
So I would argue just the opposite, that our barriers today to our using foreign students, foreign scholars, foreign technology, working with foreigners, is actually a barrier to us. In fact, let me give you some examples. Enrico Fermi was not a U.S. citizen when he did the nuclear bomb here in the United States. Most of the people who founded Silicon Valley were not U.S. citizens. We allow them, by the way, to be in the Army. 3% of the Army are non-U.S. citizens. We don't allow them in defense plants. If I go now to a university where a significant majority of the graduate engineering and science students are non-U.S. citizens, I mean, I think we need to take advantage of that, because we are a nation of immigrants. And you can do security checks on their family and that sort of thing. But for us to say they must be U.S. citizens to be able to take advantage of their advanced technology and to work on research programs, Ronald Reagan, and that's not an ultra-liberal, he put out a policy, NSDD 189, that said all fundamental research should be free and open and publishable. Anybody can work on it. They don't have to be U.S. citizens. But now, lots of times, the DoD, DOE, others put into their research contracts the requirement it must be done by U.S. citizens. That doesn't make sense to me when so large a share of the really outstanding science and engineering students, and graduate students particularly, are non-U.S.
Well, thank you for that. And I also agree with incentive-based contracting. In my past life, if you didn't perform, you were gone.
Yeah.
And it keeps a lot of people honest and keeps you very focused and motivated. So I yield back.
With that, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate this discussion about sort of value-driven decision-making. I had, in fact, earlier this week, we did a seminar which I helped sponsor related to value-driven engineering. So I really, and we should apply this in many, many realms of government. So one of the questions I have, Dr. Gansler, it's intriguing to me that you talk about potential cost savings by increasing the use of diplomacy and other soft forms of power. Could you expand on that a little bit more and try to quantify what potentially we could accomplish by doing that?
Yeah, well, one obvious example would be China helping us with North Korea, or Russia helping us with Afghanistan, or other issues that we have where we could collectively apply pressure. Similarly, if we were able to work more effectively with even our allies, so that we would have joint programs with our, say, NATO allies. Mm-hmm. When you think about the fact that 100 nations, have ballistic missiles, and we want to worry about missile defense on the fact that in the future we will be in a coalition. And you can't sort of say, well, there's a bunch of missiles coming in at us, and you pick up the phone, you say, Hans, you take the first one, Pierre, you take the second one, I'll take the third one. It has to be integrated and automatic. And we can save a lot of money if we did it that way as well, because we would have joint development, which they would pay for part of it, like we did in the Joint Strike Fighter. Remember, a couple of countries put up $1 billion each. So we can save money by the economies of scale, volume production, by integrated systems, by assuming and exercising and practicing with our coalition allies. We will actually save considerable amount of money and be much more effective as a force. which goes to the total value point. It's not just for saving money, it's for force effectiveness.
Is there, are there papers out there, is there some place where I can find more information about the quantification of that so that we can see the value of those alliances? You know, is there some place where it's actually quantified?
We've done a couple of pretty thorough literature searches on the issue, particularly of economic development, and I don't know that we have found a good set of answers there, but I'll be glad to take that question and go back and look. If I could add one more thing to what Dr. Gansler said there needs to be a recognition of that potential value of contribution from allies, et cetera, at the requirements phase. And what that sometimes means is that the military's got to give up a little bit of what they want in order to get the contribution from those who can add value to it. So the trade-off is we might not get 100% of what we want, we may only get 95%, but we end up saving 10% of the cost, and so the trade-off is one that's cost-effective, if you will. I can't quantify that, though, but you can find places where it did not happen.
I might point out that every U.S. weapon system today has foreign parts in it. Mm-hmm. And they're there because they're better, not because they're cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me ask you this. How can DOD and the industry best anticipate our future threats? How should we be doing that? What are we preparing for, and how do we figure out what to prepare for?
I would argue that one of the biggest characteristics of future threats is uncertainty. And therefore, what we need is responsiveness. And we don't have that today. We have no ability to respond rapidly to changes in threats. You may remember in the first Persian Gulf, when we needed to get more Patriot missiles, the line was available, lots of excess capacity in the line, but they didn't have parts because they hadn't prepared for the need for surge in that case. The ability to shift from one type of scenario to another type rapidly. The ability to work with our coalition allies rapidly certainly is required. I think that it's the uncertainty that the spectrum is too large. I mean, we wouldn't have thought about pirates a few years ago that we're going to worry about and on up to nuclear war. When you think about that full spectrum, it's impossible to be able to individually prepare for every one of those because of affordability. We don't have enough money to do that. So we have to be able to shift from one to the other, and that means flexibility. It means practicing shifting rapidly.
And would you say that the capacity to manufacture is also an important element that we need to maintain?
Manufacture and redesign. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not just building the same thing.
Right.
Whenever a new threat shows up, I mean, look at what happened with the roadside bombs. We hadn't expected that, so we weren't prepared. We hadn't designed our systems for it. It took a couple of years to just even recognize it was a new requirement, going to the requirement side. And then finally we get into the budget cycle, and that takes 3 years, you know, and then finally you get the design process through, and then finally you go into production. And that's not a fast response.
Mm. Thank you.
Well, probably an opportunity for another round if you... Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. And as I said, I was told don't do anything stupid quite a few times in my military career. Vice Chief of Staff for the Army, General Corelli, implemented a portfolio review process as far as their acquisition of new weapon systems. Have you all had an opportunity to sit down and talk to him or review that process that he has? And did you find that that was something being used in any other of our services?
We had some talks with them as they laid out how they were going to approach it. I have not seen the results of that analysis yet. But one thing that I think is worth noting is they recognize, you know, when you look at portfolios, you have to have a way of measuring capability across more than one weapon system, if you will. And you can measure that capability pretty well. The hard part is determining how much is enough. Mm-hmm. How do you validate the boundary, if you will, of sufficiency? It's very hard to validate that except against something that sort of looks like a threat.
Yeah.
So you can't just have capability in the abstract. It's got to be capability in a portfolio against some measure of requirement, if you will.
Okay.
I would also argue that what that is a capability not a platform, and there's a big difference there. And some people tend to think of it as, well, do I have to upgrade my tank or do I have to upgrade my airplane, as contrasted to what I really need for the potential threats in the 21st century, which are very different things. I mean, the type of equipment that we're going to need in the asymmetric world of the future, you know, capability against cyber warfare, capability against war among the people, the different intelligence capability, the benefits of unmanned systems, air, land, and sea systems, and so forth. These are very different than sort of the linear projections from the past. And we have to think about it in that form as well, I think.
You bring up a great point, because the Army that I was commissioned into in 1982 and the threats that we saw then were totally different than the threats that I saw in 2005 when I went to Afghanistan. So that leads me to what I think is a major thing that we need to look at. When you read our national security strategy, when you read our national military strategy, you know, I do not think that it really provides the ability or the focus to the defense industrial base to understand this new 21st century battlefield, these new threats, and therefore the new type of weapon systems and tools that are needed on the battlefield. Do y'all concur or disagree?
I tend to agree. We do have an institution that has a lot of institutional inertia. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily think about what might be different. And that's understandable. I mean, disruptive technologies have a lot of resistance to them. I'll give you an example. When I was undersecretary, 2 years in a row, the Air Force zeroed the unmanned airplane, the Global Hawk. I had to force them to buy an unmanned airplane, but didn't have a man in it. That's why it was resisted. I mean, it's countercultural, and that's what disruption is. And therefore, you have to, it's very difficult to ask a user for something new. They will tend to think about something better than what they now have. But these new environments coming from the research push of new technologies, disruptive technologies, are where we have to be thinking, and new kinds of warfare, you know, new threats that people are presenting. It's hard to have an institution that is geared around certain structure to shift to a new one. We need to emphasize that. I mean, if you recognize why DARPA was established, it was because the Russians put up a satellite, and none of the services had been worrying about satellites. Yeah. So we created an organization that would look at things that weren't being done by the services. And that's what we have to start thinking towards, and maybe figuring out ways to have a DARPA in each service or something.
Congressman West, I would add, you're right to focus on those documents: the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, National Military Strategy, the report of the 2010 QDR. There's a lot of good in there, but it doesn't have the precision to allow you to prioritize and make trade-offs, particularly as the budget's coming down. Congresswoman Sutton asked about the information for industry that would come out of those. It's not in there. If you look back, last summer the Defense Department submitted to this Congress a report on China military capability out to 2030 and beyond. We have more precision in what we say China is going to have in 2030 than we have about what we're going to have in 2030. That's not quite balanced.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you. And once again, that satellite question, it's once again a failure of the intelligence community to be able to predict accurately. You know, what we hear it over and over again from the last 60 years. They haven't been quite right on predicting what the future holds.
There was a lot of resistance in the intelligence community to the establishment of IARPA for the same reason.
Right. Well, that was an earmark by, my understanding, Congressman Hunter and Congressman Lewis forced the Air Force and forced the military to go develop and buy those. So thank goodness for that. Thank goodness for earmarks. With that, Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think General Dempsey said when he appeared before us that the only thing we know is that we have been 100% correct in not being able to predict anything. On that note, Dr. Gansler, I started to read your book, Democracy's Arsenal, and one of the things that struck me was why the choice in the title of Democracy's Arsenal versus America's Arsenal for the 21st century or something along those lines. And your testimony just recently about the concept of the joint development and the fact that our allies, or we would have to begin to look at development in terms of coalitions working together. Was that part of your thoughts in talking about the arsenal of the future just being democracy's arsenal, that we would be required to pull together our allies as opposed to just being United States-centric in our views?
That's a very good point. No, in fact, as you know, in the book, I try to emphasize the importance of global. I was just doing a play on words about Eisenhower's statement about, the reference to the arsenal of democracy, which was the industrial base. But the emphasis, actually, if we want to use the title, is the subtitle: creating a 21st century defense industry, not simply preserving a 20th century industry. That's the important difference that we're talking about here. And I think that emphasis of shifting to the 21st century is the focus. And part of that does have to do with the commercial world and the global world. And to the extent we can shift to recognizing the global benefits, democracy or not, that's really the focus of what I was trying to get at.
Because one of the portions of your book that I was intrigued by was, and this is something that we've been looking at, is that we do not have, or we're losing that industrial base that, like you said, General Eisenhower said, made the difference in winning the war. And yet we know that China, for example, is building ships a lot quicker and potentially better than we are, because we're losing that knowledge in this process. But at the same time, China is the rising threat in the Pacific. So how do you see us getting to a point of a global situation of joint development, or is it one basically that we have to focus on with our allies and relaxing things like ITAR, for example, and being able to do that kind of joint development and dual use and everything in a more efficient way?
Well, that was partly when the question that Ms. Sutton raised relative to soft power. To the extent that I think we should try to stop treating China as a threat and treat them as a partner in achieving peace and stability in the world. And to the extent that we do that, we'll be far better off in getting that help, if you will, with, say, North Korea or other places where they could be of assistance to us. And in terms of dealing with our allies, stop thinking as much about building walls around America, but thinking in terms of what's the most effective solution for the world. And to the extent that I think ITAR and other barriers that we have can be addressed, we need to really focus on that. And that, in many ways, that is that soft power issue, working with our allies instead of trying to each separately compete.
Mr. Burto, I think on October 24th, one of your colleagues, Mr. Chow from CSIS, appeared before us. And in that testimony, I was asking him the question about, when we don't know what the future is, even to 2020, we don't have any idea what that military is going to look like. How can we then start to plan? Because we're talking about budgets every time before us. And one of the coined phrases that I came up with after that was that we are setting policy by acquisitions. In other words, we're making acquisition decisions now, and that's going to affect us 15, 20 years from now. And that seems to be the policy of our vision of the military in the future. Do you agree with that?
It's absolutely a clear view of what goes on. I happened to be with Secretary Cheney after the launch of Operation Desert Storm in 1991 to move Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. He placed 2 phone calls after the initiation of those activities. One was to former Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger. The other was to former Secretary of Defense Hal Brown, so both a Republican and a Democrat. And what he said was the capability that we are using today is thanks to the decisions that you made 10 and 15 years ago. And I think that same thing is true for today. The hard part is not recognizing that looking backwards. The hard part is recognizing going forwards what the 15-year implications of the decisions we're making today. And inside the Department of Defense, the past is far more powerful than the future. and it's always trying to kill the future. You know, Congressman West's comment about the very different Army of today than in 1982. That Army of today is shaped by the people whose mentality was created 15 and 20 years ago, and the past is resonant in them. I think it's incumbent upon you all to be thinking through the filter of what's going to be important 15 or 20 years from now. How do we work backwards from that and use that as a way of shaping today's decisions?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Shillings, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for showing up. We're getting a lot of good things out of this today. So what I'd like to just ask, I just really got 3 or 4 questions if I have time for them. So how do you define industrial preparedness, and then how can Congress help promote it?
Well, the point that came up much earlier, which is preparing to be able to do something that was unexpected as contrasted to something that was really expected, is the difference that I think we lack today. This is the difficulty of predicting the future. I guess Yogi Berra is the most popular statement about that one. You know, forecasting is so difficult, especially about the future. You know, that it does seem that we need the flexibility and responsiveness, and we lack that. Even in the budget process, you know, there's no money set aside. And the only reason we were able to do this, some responsiveness in the last decade, has been because of the supplementals. That's sort of a slush fund. If we didn't have that, we would not be able to rapidly respond to changes that are required. And so we need to think about how one could do something rapidly, including getting the money for it, and also to be prepared in terms of the procurement practices and the policies. And in some cases, it requires us just taking action rather than going through the formal process that we do, which tends to take 3 to 5 years before you get the procurement and the budget and everything else all lined up to do something that requires a fast response. That's the preparedness area that I think we have to spend most of our attention on, and which we don't have today. The process is not responsive today.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, because who knows what's coming at us, and if we can't respond quick enough. And then also I'd like to ask you, sir, do you believe that the future of defense, the industrial base basically, will be stronger if it's allowed to partner more freely with the military organic base?
I would argue that the word partnering is a subset of competition. If you think of it as a sole source partnering, I would say we will not be more efficient. If you think of it as a form of the competition, I think back to one competition where we ran, the DOD ran, a competition for maintenance, and it was won by a public sector, actually Warner Robins in that case, but they gave 60% of it to the private sector in order to win. And that makes sense. I mean, there's some very competent, qualified, and capital provided for public sector operations. When we compete public against private, what we find is that on average, no matter who wins, the savings are over 30% and the performance goes up. But Congress has passed laws against doing that. You don't allow that anymore, the A-76 competitions. Now, my view would be you should allow the A-76 competitions and allow partnering on those, so that when the public sector bids, they can have a private sector subcontractor, or vice versa. Take full advantage of the capabilities in both the public and private, but do it in a competitive environment, not a sole source environment. That's the difference, and you've eliminated that competition. And I find it hard to believe that when you can show the data overwhelmingly favor the idea of competition in the public-private sector, and I should emphasize only for non-inherently governmental functions. The government obviously should be doing governmental functions, but a lot of things like wrench turning, read the Constitution, it doesn't mention wrench turning in the Constitution as an inherently governmental function. Therefore, that should be allowed to be competitive. And to the extent that it's competitive, the public sector will often win some of those, and they will win them often in a partnership. That's fine. I have no problem with that at all. But on the other hand, the inverse of it is mandating that it be done in the public sector. That's sole source. That's monopoly. That doesn't usually get low cost and high performance.
Very good.
Could I add two short things to that and then let you get the rest of your questions? One is I think that we have a definition of core requirements, true in the maintenance business, implied in engineering and R&D as well. I think it's actually a very good time to revisit that question, because I think the view of core is, again, a view of the past from a mobilized conventional war perspective, and I think there's a 21st century way of thinking about what core capability do we need to have inside the Department of Defense. I would urge that the panel and the committee take a look at that question. The second is investment in future capability. Partnering is fine, but I don't think it makes sense for the government to facilitize capability that's already present and resident in the supplier base, in where you have a global supply chain already in place. And so that's an area where you could save money and focus your investment on the places where that core is really needed. And I think it's a good time to take another look at that.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen.
If you have further questions, we're going to do a second round. We'll start with you if you want to finish up if you have another question.
That'd be great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have.
Can you give us that last question? Can you give us a concrete example about what you're talking about? Or
probably my best concrete example would be the new K-46 Air Force tanker, which is based upon a commercial derivative airframe that has a global supply chain already in place. This would have been true, by the way, regardless of who won that competition. Both competitors had an existing commercial airframe with a global supply chain in place. I don't think it makes sense to spend, say, $4 billion facilitizing depots to do commercial airframe repair work. The Air Force ought to focus on the military unique capabilities that it ought to have the capability to perform in-house. That's one where I think would merit a hard look.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, they answered my last question already.
Sorry about that. Thank you. And with that, go in the second round. If we want to start with Mr. Runyon, I'll finish up last. Do you have any further questions?
Just to make a point on, we've been sitting here talking whether it's core capability, force strength, versus our ability to respond to what is happening today. What's more important? I know there's a value to both of them, but I mean, moving forward.
This is kind of the historical dilemma of national security. I think that in general, the military has tended to want to pay more attention to protecting their long-term investments, again, based upon their current view of what those long-term investments ought to be. It was instructive to watch the dilemma that Secretary Gates had when he came into the Department of Defense, and recognize he's the first secretary we've ever had who spanned two presidents and two parties. It took him 2 years to get the military to focus on actually winning the wars that we were fighting today. He had to personally intervene to get MRAP procurement on the table. He had to personally intervene to increase the Air Force's development and deployment and use of unmanned aerial vehicles. Across the board, it took the personal, strong, repeated intervention of the Secretary using his full Title X authority to make that happen. And so the inertia of the institution mitigates against it. That said, their vision of what that future is that they're trying to protect the investment in is so muddied and so unclear, and General Dempsey's absolutely right. You know, it's unblemished by predictive success here. And so there needs to be a third way, and that third way needs to say we need a clear articulation of what the future is we're aiming at, but it needs to be flexible enough that we're okay standing up tomorrow and say, okay, we're smarter now than we were yesterday, so we're going to make a little bit of an adjustment. That's not present in the institution at all. It's kind of a lousy answer to your question, but it's the only way I can see to go forward.
Yeah, and I think also what we've raised here, and also in past hearings we've had, when you have that intervention, the process of whether it is a contract or anything to execute that and get it out there is one of the major obstacles, because even if you are the response is there, to execute it may have changed by the time you get it to the field.
You also need to worry, it seems to me, about the exercises that you run. One way of trying to be prepared for unexpected things is to put them into the exercise. And the problem, of course, is that messes up the exercise. You know, when they would want to prepare for Navy operations, the mines might mess it up. Or if you want to prepare for an Air Force operation, electronic warfare might mess it up, or cyber war attacks and so forth. What we need to do is be creative in the exercises in order to see how we would respond to command and control decisions and to other use of current equipment in unexpected new ways. There are two different approaches here for solving the unexpected, one of which is to get some new equipment for that unexpected area or some new service. But the fastest way is using the current stuff in a new way. And that we ought to introduce that into the exercises, I think.
Thank you both, Chairman. I yield back.
And that you mentioned the MRAP and up-armored Humvees. It was a big surprise to the military, but talking to the Special Forces community in Somalia, they learned the lesson. They had an up-armored from some countries, South Africa or somewhere, that they utilized them when they came back. One of the lessons learned was if we're going to go into an urban environment, we need an up-armored vehicle. And that fell on deaf ears until we started seeing people get killed. And
that's a good example of the multinational design.
Right.
The underneath part of that is a South African design. The shock absorbers are German design. The armor is an Israeli design, and some of the electronics are Asian.
Right.
And we take full advantage of that, including having the Secretary of Defense as the program manager to get it fast.
Right. With that, Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In that same meeting that General Dempsey said what he said, Leon Panetta also said that how we prepare for the future is we just got to be damn flexible. The problem is, what are you being flexible for? I represent Hawaii, and I met with one general there, and I said, okay, here's the Pacific, the theater of the century. So I said, what's the threat going to look like? And he proceeded to say, well, counterinsurgency here, counterterrorism here, maybe forward force here. And I said, you're naming everything that we've had from the past to now. But I said, the fortunate part is that people like, I will speak for myself, people like me, who doesn't understand necessarily all the nuances, are the ones who are going to make the decisions on what gets funded. So the reality is, we have to be flexible. We've been terrible in predicting. We are setting policy by acquisition, and we should work for a democracy's arsenal that should be a joint development. But the real, now, kind of like, okay, let's put that all together. And how do we do that? Because I think we need to understand what people foresee as the future. And unless we know what the future is, and no one knows, I understand that, what's the best guess that you have as to what we need to look like or what we need to prepare for? Because as you said earlier, it is the budget that's going to determine that, or the lack of the flexibility within the budget that's going to cause our potential, not necessarily our demise, but at least set us back for 5, 6, 7 years. So does anyone want to take a stab at that? So when I cast my vote, I can think, Dr. Gansler said this, or Mr. Burt said that, and maybe I'll go with that.
The one thing you didn't list in your list of characteristics you'd like to have is low cost. In order to have the flexibility that you need, it has to be affordable also. And especially with the budget shrinking, affordability becomes a very important characteristic. One thing we don't do in our requirements process most of the time is have cost as part of the requirement. Now, that's a military requirement because quantity is determined by unit cost. And if we can get the flexibility that comes from having a distributed sensors, distributed shooters, net-centric operations with low-cost nodes in that system, we can actually afford to have the flexibility to handle all these unexpected things. Well, the way to do that would be to make cost part of the requirement. We've done that, at least in 1 or 2 programs, and successfully, like JDAM. I have a handwritten note from the Secretary of the Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I'm sorry, saying it only has 3 requirements for that precision-guided missile. It should hit the target, it should work, and it should cost under $40,000 each. Today it hits the target, it works, and costs $16,000 each. Now we can afford to get enough of them. And if we need more of them to buy them, we can afford to do that. But in other programs, we have lost that flexibility. I mean, the Joint Strike Fighter was going to be a $35 million airplane. We kept that in the name. It's now the F-35. But it now costs over $100 million. That we've lost the emphasis, and that's understandable. In the last 10 years, we've been living in a rich man's world. Cost wasn't important. Now cost has to be the driver. And affordability for all of those constraints that you placed on it, I think are right. That's just one more item, but it's going to be a critical one.
But some of that will be taken care of if you have economies of scale to offset it. Because
Yes.
what we tend to do is hold it close to our vest, and therefore we can't kind of sell it on the open market. Mr.
I'd like to expand on that, and that is that the part of cost that's most ignored is life cycle cost, the total cost of the program. The Defense Department resists putting a number on this and giving that number to you because they say it's uncertain. Well, it's all uncertain. Give me your best guess. Give me a range. Give me the probabilities associated with those range. That's a tool that you can use in every vote on every issue and for each program. It's even true for services contracts as well as for hardware. Force them to do that because the Defense Department has an infinite negative value of money. $1 today will not be spent to save $100 down the road because that dollar today is worth more than that $100 down the road. The only way that you can offset that is from the Congress.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's actually a design characteristic, this life cycle cost. So Dave is right.
Build it in.
You build it in by designing it to be maintainable, for example.
Or I know Ms. Sutton will probably talk to you about corrosion, which broadly defined is anything unintended that deteriorates. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sutton? Yeah.
Well, I did just say to him, that's what corrosion mitigation and prevention is all about.
I didn't hear you, but I knew you were going to say it.
Well, but it is, and it's a good example of how we can enhance value for for the taxpayers. We're losing $400 billion a year in our economy to the cost of corrosion. Some 32 or 36, I can't remember.
Military is 22.
Billion. It's 22.
22 billion.
Okay. See, I've got these guys on message. I'm so glad. And of course, we're doing work to try and build in prevention and mitigation up front, which just makes sense. So it's a common sense thing. Okay. So we had a discussion about the value of working together with allies in many capacities. Now, I come from Ohio, a place with an extraordinarily strong manufacturing base, built in no small part through defense work. I am the daughter of a boiler maker who worked in a factory that made boilers for our, you can guess who that is. And so I obviously, there's nothing more important to me. I mean, obviously our defense is important, but also jobs are really important. So let's talk about the other side of that coin and the interest that we have in, as we develop our industrial base policy, the commitment we should have to jobs and putting our people to work, because I know it's a bit complicated and a trade-off. So could you both comment on that?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important is to recognize that technology, industry, and labor are now globalized. And that means that foreign investment in the U.S. creates jobs and creates exports. In fact, in many cases, greater than U.S.-owned but foreign-located here in the U.S. For example, the sixth largest defense company domestically located is BAE. The headquarters happens to be in London, but the workers are in the U.S. And they do an enormous amount of export as well. And that creates jobs. So the equity coming in and the exports going out from these foreign-owned companies is a benefit to the U.S. in terms of jobs and taxes.
I know that it can work that way, but it doesn't always work that way. Again, here's the problem of the complexity of these policies. Would you like to comment, Mr. Burchill?
There's a lot that we suspect but don't know here. We're pretty sure that there's probably some contribution made by defense manufacturing to sustain or enhance the competitiveness of the U.S. manufacturing in a global economy. But we don't have very good places where we know how to spend our dollars so that it sustains that. Let me give you two examples. In the shipbuilding business, we've evolved now to where U.S. shipbuilders fall into one of three categories, basically. They're either building warships for the U.S., and we still build by far the best warships on the planet. They're also the most expensive. Not quite sure where the trade-off is there. The second is Jones Act trade, where we're required to have U.S. hulls in order to do intercity transfer. And the third is where we're actually globally competitive, and that tends to be in businesses like oil services, small vessels, small high-speed vessels, et cetera, where we actually have a globally competitive manufacturing base that's as good or better than anybody else and is cheaper and competitive. There's no relationship between where the Navy has spent its money on those major warships and where those small high-speed vessels and oil services businesses are globally competitive. That's not by design that there's no relationship. It's just evolved that way. There are opportunities to see where that could happen. Now let me give you the other example. The other example, commercial communication satellites, right? The U.S. Defense Department is absolutely dependent on commercial communication satellites for all of its communications. 95% of bandwidth downloads in Afghanistan are over a commercial market floating overhead. Just happen to be the capacity there. We need to pick our next warp spot carefully and make sure there's enough satellites over it. But we have no responsibility for making sure those satellites are up there. We assume they're there because there's a global commercial market that provides it, right? One of those satellite operators said to me, "Woe unto you, DOD, if Princess Di and Michael Jackson happen on the same weekend because you don't have enough money to buy time anymore."
Thank you. Mr. Larsen, do you have further questions?
Dr. Gansler, how should the department weigh efficiencies achieved through contract consolidation against the potential that such consolidation can eliminate small business opportunities?
Let's see, there's two things in that question. One relates to small business alone, the other relates to competition per se. One of the things that I think at the second half of that is easiest is why don't we compete things when we know the benefits of competition? For example, on the second engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, hopefully you've all read The Great Engine War and you're familiar with the fact that by having the two engine suppliers in the U.S. both build them.
Wasn't it enough that we lived it, that we had to read it too?
The reality is you want to make sure you got the benefits of it. You know, the fact that both of them got higher performance at lower cost and higher reliability as that program went along because they competed for a share of the business. Now we have the largest program in history and we're not doing it. It makes you wonder, it affects employment as well as it affects everything else, but most importantly, it affects how many we can buy with higher performance and higher reliability. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't we do it? Well, now to go to your second half of your question about the small business effects of competition. Yeah. It seems to me that if you think about where the small business has its biggest impact on the large programs, it's at the lower tiers. And therefore, trying to encourage small business participation in the large programs is a big benefit for the small business, and it's a big benefit for the primes who can manage those small businesses. Now, what we do find too often, unfortunately, is the small business is just a front for the subcontract activities, and that's asking them to manage the larger contracts below them. I don't think that's a necessary benefit to us. But so I think we do want to think more about the small business at the lower tiers as part of the contractual discussions, and making that maybe part of the incentive for awards. But doing it carefully, not just as a scorecard basis again, but making sure we're getting small businesses that do a good job. And so past performance for them counts just like past performance for the large ones.
Yeah. Let me give you a specific example, not of this issue, but a specific example from a company. It's in my district. Came up at our roundtable we had in August. This particular company does a service for one of the services, and they were asked to develop basically develop the requirements, develop the how-to manual, just develop everything, and then in order to compete for the job, they had to hand over everything. Then the service went and competed that job so that all the competitors for this particular small business, locally owned, had to compete for the work that they did for this particular service, and their competitors got to see all the work and then compete for it as well. Is there a way to protect that intellectual property in the contracting process?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that has been happening that really bothers me is the trend to not having the unsolicited proposal being awarded because it doesn't count as a competition. But when someone comes in with a really good idea, why wouldn't you fund it? We used to do that, and it made a lot of sense. And the small businesses were the ones that usually came in with these good ideas. And they would just simply say, here's a great idea. Would you just pay for the development of it? And then you can later have a competition for not the design, don't give out the drawings, but for the function. You can have functional competitions, and they make a lot of sense. But I would encourage the idea that when a small business has a good idea, they get it funded on a sole source basis. There's no risk to that. Mm-hmm. It's small money, and usually that's a way to get disruptive ideas in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ms. Burto, any thought?
I think there are three challenges that have to be tackled before you can fix the problem that company faced there. One is that the Defense Department just fundamentally doesn't have enough good data about particularly the second and third tier suppliers, and that's where those guys started from, if you will. They may have gotten up to that point. And in part because the government no longer pays for that information, and because the government doesn't pay for it, and most of the contractors only operate on a cost reimbursable basis, they don't collect that information either. So the data is just simply not there. And that's in both directions. That is, small businesses that have large businesses as their subcontractors, and large businesses that have small businesses as their subcontractors. So you don't really have a good picture of the true universe, and that makes it very hard to make any policy judgments or policy decisions. The second is the difficulty that any individual procuring contracting officer has making a decision that recognizes the reality that you described there, a reality that says, this actually isn't fair. This doesn't make sense, right? They've got to have such an amount of justification and documentation that warrants a decision that looks like a violation of the rules, but really isn't, because the rules are written to permit that, to permit judgment. This gets back to the question of the acquisition workforce, which I think was alluded to earlier, both in statements from you all and in Dr. Gansler's testimony. We don't have the experience base in our defense acquisition workforce today, and if there's only one thing that this panel does, you've got to reinforce the need and the efforts to rebuild the capability of that workforce, because we rely on their judgments in making those contracting decisions, and you don't get that experience except through the passage of time, and that you can't work 10 times as hard for 1 year and come out with 10 years worth of experience, although we try that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that you have, in your case, I think if you peel back the layer, you'll see that there's an inadequate amount of information, and so they err on the side of, well, let's just protect ourselves. There's an inadequate experience level in the workforce, so they err on the side of let's just follow the checklist, and there's an adequate willingness on the part of the leadership to let them take a risk and say, you know what, we deserve to pursue it the right way here. Yeah. I don't think you have any of those present there, and you've got to tackle all three of those.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me follow up on that. So we're lacking that. Why are we lacking it? There's been folks leaving that part of the defense, or we don't train them?
You passed a law about a 25% reduction is one of the reasons that Congress did. This is Duncan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So guilty of that?
What happened was in the post-Cold War period, the dollars shrunk and the DOD properly cut back, and then you passed a law further, another 25%. So we had a huge reduction. Then when the budget went way up, the DOD undervalued the value of this acquisition workforce. For example, the Army had 5 general officers with contracting background. When I did that commission for Secretary Gates, that they had 0 in 2008. Defense Contract Management Agency had 4 general officers. They went to 0. They went from 25,000 people to 10,000 people. Now what I'm seeing is that each of the agencies are starting to bring in interns. fact, over 1,000 interns, and only 3 highly qualified experts, so-called, that you allow, and they're the people with industry experience. Right. And they would bring a lot more than the 1,000 interns. 1,000 interns will be great in 15 years, but in terms of the near-term acquisition problem, we're not filling that gap as much as we ought to do, I think.
But I think the record should show that for about the last 3 years, maybe 4 years, the Defense Department, because I think it actually preceded the current administration, the Defense Department has put a considerable amount of energy into hiring and training and retaining the beginnings of that workforce, but it's going to take years to build it back up.
Is there any way that we can go to the private sector and get them to help in this, outsourcing the acquisition people to come in, and is that
as long as you avoid the conflict of interest issues?
Right.
First of all, they shouldn't do work that is inherently governmental. You have to be very careful of that.
Right.
And secondly, they should not be writing the requirements
right.
and then bidding on it.
Right. Well, and there's people UPS. They do business with the government, but they're not bidding. But I'm sure they're out there. I know they go out there, they acquire trucks and tires and all kinds of complicated systems. Can you bring in? Is that in the realm of possibility in your minds?
Well, that's what the highly qualified experts are. You hire someone from one of those companies
right.
to actually right. do the inherently governmental work.
Right.
And assist them with contractors to do analysis or data gathering or things like that, but not decision making.
Right.
That's inherently governmental.
Because when I think about that, I use UPS because I read in one of your testimonies the logistics system.
Yes.
It's a huge $200 billion, and it's
outdated. It's not world class by any means
right.
in terms of reliability, in terms of responsiveness, in terms of
right.
cost, in terms of labor, so forth. That's an area we need to modernize.
FedEx or UPS could come in and turn it into what they do today.
Or bring some of their senior people as highly qualified experts and then
right.
contract with them to do some of that work.
Right.
But I do it in a competitive fashion, even public-private competitions.
Right.
But we need to keep in mind there that UPS is the distribution system, but they don't actually set the requirements. In other words, Walmart may rely on UPS and FedEx to make
right.
sure they get everything, but only the demand that comes out of Walmart is what sets the requirements. So it's really a marriage of UPS and Walmart, if you will, that
right.
we have to have.
But what they could do would be those companies today, like UPS and FedEx, they don't think of themselves as transportation companies. They think of themselves as information companies.
Right.
They do total asset tracking. We don't have total asset visibility in our system. That's shocking.
Right.
We should have that.
Right. And could you comment on the impact of the failure to have a long-term reauthorization of the SBIR program?
It's shameful. That's my honest assessment. That program has been demonstrated to be successful.
Right.
Why wouldn't you extend it?
Completely agree. I probably wouldn't use the adjective shameful, but my thesaurus runs dry right now.
Also, a question, and we've learned through these hearings and these roundtables, a situation that, like, as Mr. Larsen pointed out, intellectual property rights are having to be given up to compete, but also when the auditing comes in and you've got a company, we heard in his district also, a company of 5 people, and when they come in, it's like they're dealing with Boeing. You got 5 people. Is there, in your view and your experience, and I don't know how much experience you have with that part of the process, but how do we make it so that it almost needs to have a 2-tiered approach? The big contractors are going to have a much more robust and group coming in from the Department of Defense to audit them versus these small companies that virtually, they're shutting down. They've got to tell people stop working and start doing compliance. So is there anything in your view that we could change that, an idea to push forward?
Again, I think it's focusing on price, not cost. I talked to one semiconductor manufacturer who was world-class commercial supplier, and I said, why aren't you supplying to the Defense Department also? He said, because you care about accounting for every dollar against each part, and we care about reducing the price of our parts.
Right.
And it's a very big difference in attitude.
Right.
We should care about being competitive. in terms of performance and cost, not just cheap, but performance and cost.
Mr. Schuster, we've actually taken an extensive look at the question of Defense Contract Audit Agency and its interaction both with industry and with contract administration. We haven't yet produced results of that assessment, but I expect we'll have something coming out perhaps even before your 6-month window is closed. And I'll be glad to share that with you when that's done.
Let me put an idea out there, and there's industries in this country that self-regulate. The financial industry has FINRA, the CPAs in this country, the bar for the most part, they regulate themselves. Is there a potential to have a self-funded mechanism by defense contracts, especially the small and medium-sized ones, to go in and almost self-regulate themselves, obviously with oversight of, with FINRA, the SEC is always looking over their shoulder. But is that something that has any merit to look at, or is that something that's completely out of the realm?
I think you clearly do need oversight.
Sure.
But not more oversight than competence. And, the problem that we have, I found in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had more auditors than we had people writing contracts. And yet we had a large number of contractors, larger number than military people over there. I do think that the best regulation is the market. And through competition, you're going to get, if you focus on performance and cost, not just cheap, that using the market as your regulator through competition, you'll get higher performance at lower cost without having to audit it.
With that being said, you also believe that, as we had a number of people testify, and I don't know if you've wrote it in your studies, but this is not a free market. Our defense industry base is not a traditional free market.
But you can create a market. It's not a free and open. In fact, there's an argument in a lot of data to show that free and open is less effective than effective competition. It's even limited competition to those who are qualified.
Right.
Now, that does eliminate a lot of the small businesses, so you have to figure out some way to get them into it as well. You don't want to just have people who have done it before. Right. But on the other hand, for the larger programs or the fast response, prior experience matters as well.
Across the government and in the Defense Department, we have a surprisingly high percentage of contracts that are listed as competitive but only have one bidder. Now, that merits some further investigation, in my opinion. Something like 20% of contracts are competitive contracts with only one bidder. Now, either that means there really is only one legitimate bidder, and we're only putting up the illusion of competition so that we don't have to write a justification for a sole source contract, or we're not doing a good enough job of making sure that we're soliciting input from legitimate competitors.
Right. And what about the idea that I said about the self-regulation, setting it up like a FINRA with the SEC, overseeing it, and letting the Defense Auditing Agency take care of the Boeings and the Lockheeds, but have this organization that understands small business, but yet has strict regulatory, the rules are in place and the oversight's there with the
industry has been proposing to do more of self-regulation. Ever since the Packard Commission, that was one of the things that they had proposed at that time to us. Okay. And I think certainly self-control, if you remove some of the current regulation, but adding more external regulation and then expecting that the cost of that, is going to be forgotten or ignored. Because I remember years ago when a detailed study was done by Coopers and Lybrand comparing the same item being built in a defense plant and in a commercial plant. And then the difference was an added 17%. Today it's even greater because of regulation.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I would support self-regulation in the sense that you described there, but I think there are a couple of elements of that idea that merit very serious attention. One is one that we've tried in the past and abandoned for a variety of reasons. Historical GAO has written about this, and that is that what the contract auditors would do would certify the system, and then the results of the system would essentially be accepted as valid, so that instead of verifying and validating and auditing every single data element, you certify the process and the results of that process. That is an element of what would be essential to self-regulation. I think that's an element that merits attention, if you will. The second is, in fact, the idea that not every potential problem is of equal value and importance. And we actually, if we have a limited number of resources and a limited number of contract auditors, and we do, we ought to focus their attention on the things where the risk is the highest and the payoff is the greatest. Contract auditors measure their success by the number of costs that are questioned and the amount of those questioned costs that are sustained. What they really ought to measure their success by is the timeliness and value of the ultimate delivery of the results of those contracts. They're independent and separate from that. And in that sense, that's where the market issue has to come back into play.
Well, thank you. Does anybody have any further questions? Well, thank you both very much. This was a very enlightening and an excellent hearing. Appreciate your insights and look forward to seeing the results of that study you're doing on the Defense Auditing Agency. That's what it's focused on. And you anticipate in the next month or two?
Our ability to predict the future is actually no better than DOD's.
Is that because you've been working with him for so long that you've caught that cold?
Yeah, we do reflect the reality that we operate in, I'm sorry to say. No, I don't have a specific timetable, but knowing the interest of this panel, I'll go back and take a look at that and let you know.
And as I said earlier to you, and I think you confirmed this, we're chartered for 6 months, but as one of you said, it's at the end of 6 months you might just be starting to ask the right questions, which I fully believe that this is going to be a multiple-year project to be able to really drill down in, get the right answers, and come forward with significant policy directives to change the culture over at across the river. So again, thank you all very, very much for being here, and just remind the members, December the 9th in New Jersey, we can take the train up. It should be pretty easy, and everybody can fly out of Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia is close enough, right, John? The airport, Philadelphia airport would be the main airport out of you. So across the river, so that'll be easy trip. And also take a look at that January 8th to the 13th. Like to get confirmations or denials before right after we get back from Thanksgiving. So again, thank everybody for being here. I thank you for spending time with us. Thanks.
Thank you.